America is an empire in decline. It's inevitable. We're beset by debt, and we've gotten soft in our relatively old age. That's conventional wisdom, not, according to my guest today, George Friedman. He's the founder of STRATFOR, which is an intelligence strategic advisory firm, and the author of The Next 100 Years. George, welcome. So, briefly speaking, why do you think that America, it's not only going to continue to remain the world's great power, but this is going to be the American century after all?
Well, geopolitics is about fundamentals, not about headlines. The United States is larger than the next 4 economies combined. It is an industrial power larger than the combined industrial output of China and Japan, and that's after deindustrialization. And above all, the United States Navy controls all the oceans of the world. No power in human history has ever achieved that. So when you take a look at the fundamentals of American power, and you ignore the headlines and the commentary and all the talking heads, there's no one to replace it. Power and decline is a relative thing. So if the United States is in decline, who's rising? And no one is rising to the level the United States has already achieved.
Right, so we're going to talk about another second. There are some regional powers you see rising around the world, but none that would threaten the U.S. like Russia conceivably did after the Second World War.
None that can possibly challenge a country that controls an entire continent. I'll give you one figure to bear in mind. Japan has a population density of 365 people per square kilometer. Germany has one of 260. American population density is 34, not counting Alaska.
Because that would be unfair if we count Alaska. Right?
I mean, this is a vast, underpopulated continent that is already phenomenally wealthy.
Right. And that population density is important because you talk about your book, global population you see is declining in this century, especially in the developed world. So you actually think there's going to be competition for immigrants, as opposed to right now the headlines are about how do we keep the immigrants out and concerns about illegals building fences with Mexico. You're saying in the coming century the developed nations are going to actually be bidding for immigrants.
We're used to a universe in which the one surplus there is labor. We have population birth rates plunging all over the world, including Bangladesh. We're moving into a period of population shortage. We've already talked about graying. Population shortage means labor costs rising and greater competition to get labor. The U.S. is really good at integrating immigrants. We cry about it a lot, but we really do that very well over the past century and a half. The Europeans and the Japanese are awful at that. And that's going to mean another dimension of power for the United States. Their populations are falling. The American population is actually rising somewhat.
Right. Interesting. Because just in terms of economics, though, obviously you're saying we're going to need that labor because we're an aging population. We're going to need people to take care of our elderly and also just to work in the factories and other service centers.
Historically, economics consists of land, labor, and capital. For the past 500 years, capital was the thing we were shortest of. That's not our shortage going into the 21st century. It's going to be labor. And acquiring labor at efficient costs is going to be the greatest challenge for any country.
Right. But in terms of, as you referenced the capital issue, obviously America, we're very deeply in debt. And you write in your book that the current crisis you think is a straw in the wind for what may occur 30, 40 years down the road. But right now you think the crisis in terms of the headlines are overblown in terms of their threat to American power?
When you take a look at a debtor, you don't ask what he's making. You take a look at his net worth. We've calculated the net worth of the United States at about $339 trillion. When you take a look at the debt we're talking about relative to net worth, it's trivial. When you look at the net worth of Iceland and take a look at the debt it had, it ruined the country. So one of the things that in this crisis people have simply ignored, which you cannot ignore when you talk about national or corporate solvency, is net worth.
Right. So, and you're saying debt to net worth is more important than debt to GDP because you hear a lot of talk about how our debt to GDP is rising into the 20, 30% range, and that typically is a point where countries run into trouble.
When you talk about bankruptcy, you always talk about net worth. So when people say the United States is bankrupt, you've got to ask the question, what is the net worth? And when you calculate the enormous net worth of the United States, there's one thing you know. The debts we're talking about are 2 to 3% of net worth.
Right. So manageable.
Mildly painful, but it's like a guy who has $100 million who winds up in a $2 million death. Unfortunate, but hardly the end of the world.
Right, and so before we wrap, I know this book's more about geopolitics in economics per se, but what do you see as being the economic driver of America's economy for the rest of this century?
Well, first of all, from our point of view, economics is a subset of geopolitics. It's just one of the things that makes it up. It's not an autonomous field. One of the tremendous drivers of the American economy is going to be, as I've said before, the efficiency with which it handles immigration. In a world where Germany can be expected to be 25% smaller in 30 years than it is today, where Russia can expect to be 40% smaller, the United States is actually going to have a larger balanced labor force. So the relative power between the United States and a country like Germany is just extraordinary. I mean, how can the United States weaken when Germany is declining by 25% and the United States is holding stable or growing population base?
All right, well, we'll talk about what's happening when India and China and some of the countries that are rising in another segment. So before we wrap, you're talking about a labor shortage in this country, which means jobs will be plentiful. Right now, everyone's, of course, worried about losing their job or trying to find a job. When do you see this playing out? Is this something that our grandchildren are going to enjoy, or is this going to provide some relief for Americans today looking for work?
Well, this is a mathematical problem. It's really arithmetic even. You have a birth rate in the advanced industrial world of between 1.3 and 1.7 births per woman. You need 2.1 to maintain the population. Within 20, 30 years, most of the advanced industrial countries are going to be losing population at a dramatic rate. Germany will go down to 25-30%. The United States will also decline by that, but they'll compensate for it with immigration. And most of that immigration is going to come from Asia and from Mexico. So that's going to change the nature of the United States. We're going to hold our workforce, but by changing our country.
Right, but this is a longer-term forecast. This is not something that's going to happen anytime soon to relieve people right now who are looking for a job.
When I was young, 20 years was a long time. Today,
not so
it's
much.
pretty fast.
All right.